One of the themes now used by the prophets to bring hope was the notion of a remnant. Once, Israel had been a powerful holy nation. Then the kingdom had split, and the 10 northern tribes had been swallowed up by Assyria. Now Judah, the southern kingdom and its capital Jerusalem, had been ravaged. The people saw themselves as decimated, powerless, a handful of exiles, a mere scrap of a people. The prophets insisted that God could and would use this tiny remainder to carry out God's plan. Listen to what God says through the prophet Zechariah. But now I will not deal with the remnant of this people as in the former days, says the Lord of hosts. For there shall be a sowing of peace. The vine shall yield its fruit, the ground shall give its produce, and the skies shall give their due, and I will cause the remnant of this people to possess all these things. God has never been put off by what is small or insignificant. On the contrary, God seems to delight in using what the world deems as useless in order to do wondrous things. Another theme that gains more and more power during this time of exile is the coming of a Messiah. For hundreds of years, people had looked back with sad longing to the glory days of King David. But now, they did not even have a country, much less a king. What could pitiful exiles hope for? The prophets announced that God would send a Messiah, one who would be as wonderful and as powerful as David, a true son of David. This Messiah would restore them to their true holy nation status. The latter chapters of Isaiah paint a picture of a suffering servant. We Christians have seen this suffering servant as the same one who would come as the Messiah. These 4 servant songs describe one who will bring into the world God's passion for justice and mercy, and by his own suffering will heal God's people. We mentioned in our very first session that the first creation story, as it stands in Genesis 1, is a story that counters the creation story of the Babylonians. It was meant to keep the exiles from caving in to the Babylonian gods, who on the surface at least seemed to be ruling the roost. One of the most important things that kept these exiles from surrendering their faith in Yahweh was their memory of God's actions in the past. That memory lived in 2 forms. First, it lived in stories handed down from generation to generation. Even today there are oral cultures whose history lives mainly in the form of stories told by parents to their children. But the memories of Israel's past also lived in writings of many different sorts. During this time of exile and in the years that followed it, these writings were gathered and organized into coherent form. The oral stories were also written down, and to a large extent what we know as the Old Testament came into being. It is divided up like this in the Hebrew Bible: the Law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The prophets, the former prophets, which we call the historical books, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, which we call the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then the writings: Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. These texts were crucial to the survival of God's people. They no longer had many external demonstrations of God's power in their lives. No grand temple, no Ark of the Covenant, no glorious kingdom. But they had the stories of how they had come to be a holy nation and of how God had acted in their past. They had the wisdom of Solomon's Proverbs, the poems and songs of their worship in the book of Psalms, and they had God's words of warning spoken to them by the prophets. More and more, they became a people of the book. Before we wrap up the story of what happens to these exiles, let me just say a word about names. If you remember, the earliest name for the people was the people of Israel, named after Israel or Jacob, who had 12 sons. The nation they formed was also named Israel. When the nation broke apart, the 10 northern tribes kept the name Israel, and the 2 southern tribes took the name Judah after one of their tribes. The northern kingdom was swallowed up by Assyria. The southern kingdom, Judah, was destroyed by Babylon, and many of its inhabitants carried into exile. These people were called Jews, after the name Judah. That is the name used in the New Testament and today for the people. But these exiles were still children of Israel, so the country they longed to return to, and the modern nation state in the Middle East, is still called by